My name is Andrew Duckett. I lead developer experience at Discover Financial Services, and so I want to take a few minutes today and talk through how we use some of the open source and inner source principles to build golden paths to help developers, at Discover create amazing software. So when we started this journey with developer experience, which I feel like is the new buzzword for DevOps or inner source or whatever, we started thinking to ourselves, like, how can we enable developers to spend time what they do best, which is developing software. We knew that we wanted to build this model around a community of people. We wanted to give them the space to innovate, create new solutions, new technology, using inner source and open source solutions. And we also knew that we wanted to build our own contribution model so that as teams started to innovate and give back new solutions, we could federate and spread that across the organization. And so if these characteristics sound familiar, I think they'll align really well to what you hear it takes to build an open source community. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. Before we do that, though, I want everyone to maybe take a step back, maybe close your eyes, and think for a minute. You're in a place with some of your fellow developers, and you're having a conversation. That could be the water cooler. That could be having a beer after work. That could be at your huddle. And I want you to imagine that you're in their position, and there's a new person on your team. Says hi. That engineer joined a few weeks ago, and right away they're set off to do something. They're set off to create a new API. And so they ask a question like this. And you're thinking to yourself, like, oh yeah, like it's just a simple API, that should be easy enough to make. And then they go on to say something like this: it's just code in a repository, and magic happens, customers get value, and we've won. Can't really be that hard, can it? So as you can imagine, in an organization like Discover, it's not just about the code that you create and the repository that it lives in. There's all of these surrounding concerns that you have to deal with. And so I imagine you're thinking to yourself, like, that's hilarious. This is going to be really cute for this new developer that just started to create this new technology. And then you've got the experts in the room, right? And they all chime in with, oh yeah, you need to do this thing, and maybe this thing. And we also have to set up logging and monitoring because that's a thing that's important to us. And that list goes on and on and on. And eventually you hit security, and everyone goes, wait, we have to build security in? That's a real thing that we have to do? And so I think you can imagine that conversation, probably starts to look something like this, when all I really set out to do was build a simple API. And so that's a lot to take in. It's a lot to deal with. And you can think about, like, a new developer is probably thinking something like this, like, all I want to do is write code, and now I have to do all of these other things. And so at Discover, we thought maybe we can use something like golden paths to help. So the definition of golden paths, you'll see this at Spotify, Netflix, these large kind of innovative tech companies, and it goes a little bit something like this. We didn't invent this definition, but I think it rings true. What we really wanted to do was create something that was both opinionated and supported by the larger organization, and that path should be to create something, to build something. That could be anything. That could be an API. That could be a React web app. That could be anything that I wanted to create. And so we think of these as like higher order workflows or pipelines. They are, in fact, the step-by-step tutorial of tutorials to do that thing. And so we stitch those together into something that we call golden paths. So to do that, we wanted to think about, like, why do we think that can help? And the first answer is to minimize some of that cognitive load. So when I went to go create that API, I had to think about all these surrounding things: security, observability, the SRE stack, monitoring, logging. I had to choose a language. I had to choose a platform to deploy to. And so if we can just normalize some of that load, we can really get back to letting the developer do what they do best and what they love to do, which is developing the solution that's going to impact ultimately a customer. And so we think that this leads to developers being able to focus on higher order things, which is their problem domain or their product backlog. And so they can use that creativity to really help their team do better. The second goal that we had was we really wanted to be able to turn rumor into what we call recommended. And so by that I mean there's this new engineer behavior where they ask the person on their team, and they ask the subject matter on the next team, and they ask the next person, what's the right way to do that, or how do I make that happen? And so as you can imagine, this is like the 2022 version of the game telephone, where by the time I get the actual answer, that's a little bit different than the question that I started out with. And so what that ends up happening is there's all of this fragmentation, in the ecosystem. And it's not that any of these answers are wrong, they're just a little bit different. And so that makes it a little bit difficult to, create consistency in the environment. And so I think that this is a good way to help. And then again, we think that having that consistency starts to tackle some of the fragmentation and inconsistencies that we see. So if I look back at Discover, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, we were all probably in the same place where these new words like cloud modernizations and DevOps and kind of this new ecosystem of working in the engineering space started to happen. And we were the same way. And what ended up happening was each individual team would get really excited to use that new stack, that new tech, but they would all come up with their own nuanced implementations. So while they were the same, they all looked a little bit different, and so that puzzle is very difficult to put together. So any level of consistency that we can create, we feel like helps remove some of the burden and the load when I want to create something new again. So when we set off to do this, we decided that, what we should really create is a set of guiding principles, like something that would lean us back into, our goal at the end of the day. And so what we wanted to do was think about, okay, well, when we went down this rabbit hole, how would we know to steer ourselves back? And so we spent some time brainstorming, and we came up with these principles that help us guide into creating golden paths. And so the first thing that we believe that a golden path needs to do is it needs to define step by step by step. It needs to be very careful and inclusive to include every step. And so that can be as simple as enter this field or enter this value in this form field, take this value and put it in that field, click next. And we really want it to be as simple and straightforward as we can. And the second thing that we wanted to do was be very careful to tell the truth. And so it's really easy when you get into these conversations, as you can imagine, to think about, how could we make that better? Or what if we did this instead? Well, that's great. That's a fantastic item to add to the backlog or the parking lot. The primary objective here was let's state the truth. Let's tell it how it really is. And so I know that can be frustrating for engineers to still have to do this process manually. The first step was just to write it down. And I think you'll find as we go through this story that starts to create, and whether you want it to or not, that starts to really create a set of requirements that you can use to kind of streamline automation. It'll tell you where to attack next. And so as that process or those steps start to introduce a lot of wait time, start to introduce a lot of things that are repetitive and repeatable, those become backlog items to use for improvement. So it's kind of a double win, as you can imagine. The second principle when we started creating these is we wanted them to be extensible. And so while we're going to write on paper the recommended way to do a thing, what we need to enable teams to do is we need them to be able to add their own complementary paths or capabilities that we just haven't covered, and we like to think of that as yet. So just because the golden path doesn't state the way it should work today, that doesn't mean that it can't be part of the golden path tomorrow. And so that's a really good way to understand how users are actually using your technology ecosystem. Start to pull in some of those requirements, promote them as, hey, if this becomes the way that people use it, then that should probably be in the golden path. And we also knew that we wanted to be able to create an extensible guide. And so we drafted these style guides that really talk about if you're going to create a step in a golden path, these are the things that you must include. And so some of those things are, you need to tell them at the beginning of the step what they need to bring to the table. And so that could be a name that I use somewhere else. That could be a repository name. That could be an owning team that's responsible for this thing. And so we think about these are all the things that you need to bring to the table. And then we're very particular about the ordering and steps that take place. We try to make sure that everything is, again, documented explicitly. And then the last thing that we ask in our style guide is that they know what they're going to get and what to expect when that thing happens. So again, if I think about submitting a form to request something, I know at the end what I'm going to get, and I know where I can take that to go to the next step. And so by using these templates, we feel like we've created a way for people to extend and leverage these golden paths really to satisfy their own needs. And then again, the third principle that we really leaned against is we wanted these to be optional. And so while these may be the opinionated and recommended path, if we say it's the only path, we really stifle innovation. And so we want teams to be able to innovate. We want them to be able to lean down their own paths and explore new things. We also make sure that we want to have an easy on-ramp to come back. And so if you've gone down this path and you decide, hey, I don't want to take on owning this by myself. I'd rather lean back into the golden path. There's a really easy on-ramp to get back to the golden path. And so we feel like this creates an environment where teams can sidestep, innovate, try new things, practice, and then come back to the table, right, and realign as they mature. And so we think these 3 guiding principles set us up for success when we want to go create golden paths. So the next thing that we needed a plan. We needed to know, like, okay, we know what our guardrails are. We know kind of how we want this to function. So how do we actually go out and start to do this? And so the first thing that we needed to find an audience. And so this could be anybody. For us, this was a developer, and particularly we focused on new developers. We have a belief that an expert that's been at the company, for example, for a number of years has a level of knowledge that maybe a new person doesn't, and that's okay. But if we can assume that they know nothing, it's really easy for those experts to skip ahead or move through at their own pace. But it also doesn't exclude those new developers that are coming on board. And so we feel like they're the primary user in our audience, and so we always lean on, could a new person on day one get this to work? I'll tell you a story about that in a minute, how we made that assumption and were wrong and had to kind of reiterate on some of that stuff. The third thing that we need is we decided that we needed to focus on just one thing. And so our golden paths create one thing at Discover. And so for us, that's technology. That's a solution that we think of as an API, a front end, for example, in React. It could be a data model, it could be an infrastructure component, but it's just one thing. And what's interesting about that is that we can then start to kind of layer them together to create more complex things, right? They can grow into these bigger organisms. At Discover, we like to think of technology in terms of a component, which would be like one deployable unit, so like one API, one data store, whatever. We like to think about resources, which are things that you consume. That could be storage or compute or network. And then we think of systems as the groupings of those things. So like large systems are composed of many components and resources, and those often align to like one business context is the way that we think about it. And so we started with, let's create systems and components because those are the building blocks. We need those things in order to function in technology. And we quickly realized that a person on day one, even if you could tell them how to make a component, they probably didn't have a workspace to work in. And so we backpedaled very quickly and said, hey, maybe we should start with just, I got a laptop, how do I move forward? And so we ended up realizing that we needed that bootstrap golden path of, this is how I set up a workstation. This is how I become functional on a team. Then I can go through and teach them how to create software, how to create systems, et cetera. And so we made a little mistake, a little step there that we had to go back and redo, but I think we're in a better place now because I can use that initial golden path, how to set up a workstation, to then stem into all the other different domains fairly quickly. And the last thing is we also believe that this one thing has to be functional in production. So while it's really neat to create a component that never goes to production, that doesn't actually add any value to anything. And so everything that we create must be ready for production. So as you can imagine, that adds another layer of complexity, another set of paths, another set of instructions that we have to do because that's a whole separate ballgame. So these things together we felt like composed really healthy paths. And then the third thing we knew we needed to have to do was, I think there's probably 3 or 4 ways this could have been tackled. One way would be to grab the brightest of the brightest, the experts in the organization, hold them up in a boardroom, and don't let them emerge until they can create the golden path. And so while that may work, we thought it'd be a lot more functional if we could just ask people that are actually doing it how they're doing it. And so what we found, and you may realize this, people do write this down. They write it down for their team or themselves or the new hire that they just got. It's really just a matter of engaging them and asking them and kind of curating what they have, formatting it in a way that's stitchable and streamable into these golden paths. I think these great examples do exist. It's just a matter of finding them. And so we thought the best way to do this would be to engage the community. And so we set up groups, focus groups really, to talk about, hey, how do you guys build software? And as we started to unpack and uncover some of those questions, we started to realize, they've they've already documented that, or they've already written that down. And as we took another look, we could take like 10 teams, and they've all kind of written the same thing down, which is awkward, but healthy. And then we can start to layer those together and say, okay, well, this is the way that teams are creating software in our organization. That probably should be, part of the path. So now we have a plan. We know who we want to target. We know who we want to engage with. We need to figure out how to make this work. And so I'm sure you're asking yourselves, well, that doesn't really sound anything like open source yet, and I thought this was an open source conference. So I'm hoping now we can start to lean on some of those open source principles about how we in fact engage a community, help them, help us contribute to this space. One of the things that we really struggled with, or we thought we would struggle with, is like, how do we manage the life cycle of these things? So it's great to write everything down, but what happens when it changes? And what happens when a new system is engaged, or we have a new component that we can use, or some new technology is added to the organization? So keeping these things up to date is really important to have a community that leads and helps drive and contribute to that, because again, that group of people can't possibly know everything. It's too much to know. So we thought the way we could do this first was just lead with transparency. And so we thought if we could just go out to all of these communities and think of like small teams as their own little community, we go out to all these communities, we could find all the great things and just start to stitch them together. Functionally, that's just a link, right? If we start to stitch them together, then we could start to create an ecosystem that said, hey, like everybody's talking about this stuff. What if we all work together to create a consistent, definition or plan? And so opening up the gates of transparency, leaning on, hey, this stuff exists, here it is, really started to get people engaged. And so once we led this way, now people are starting to ask questions. So now they're coming to us and saying, hey, I see these two people have done this thing that looks a lot, they look a lot alike. They're both creating an API and it looks really consistent, but there's some differences. What should the differences be? It's really easy then to engage that group of people and say, okay, well, these two things are a little bit different. Let's talk about that. Why are they different? How do we make them consistent? Should they be consistent? And so through this kind of iterative engagement, we found that just documenting what they were and then documenting the decisions that came out of those conversations started to lead to really like consistent and quite frankly beautiful paths about how people were actually functioning. I imagine a lot of those people too like learned something new that they didn't know before. And so all we attempted to do was provide context into that conversation, narrow it down to something specific. Hey, these two things look alike. Let's talk about why they're different. And that set us up really well to document and start to capture what that looked like. This one's a little bit contentious. We did realize that we needed to get out of the way of developers and help them help themselves. And so we need to change their habit from, hey, that thing doesn't work for me, to, hey, like, what if I made an update that started the conversation about why that's different, right? And so we wanted to shift the mental model from, I can't use that, it's not for me, and walk away from the table, to, hey, I have a different idea, maybe this works better for us, let's bring it to the table and have that conversation. And so we really attempted to use knowledge to stitch those people together to create the conversation. And what that did was meant that the people that started to bubble up as the experts, they brought the most informed information to the table. Like, they brought their expertise to the conversation. And it turns out that as we thought they would be very opinionated and combative, they were actually very open and honest about why it doesn't work for them, how they would like it to work. And so that created a really like safe and open space to have that conversation. So yeah, we really wanted to focus on helping the developers have the conversation, not telling them what the answer is. We feel like if we give them a space to do that, they're more inclined to tell us the truth, tell us how it works, why it doesn't work. So yeah, create a really healthy space for us. The last thing that we wanted to do was, again, identify that center of gravity. And so we found that as you put maybe 5 people together about a very specific and pointed topic, oftentimes they themselves find a center of gravity. And so while they may come with a bias, they end up rationalizing like, hey, it would be really nice if everybody did it the same way. And so we can use consensus within these communities to say that is in fact the recommended way. And I know that sounds weird because a lot of us like to think that the recommendations come from, for example, architecture or leadership. But let's be real, like in an organization of 3,000 developers, the developers are going to use the software to their best, knowledge. Like, they're going to use it the way they're going to use it. And so that may be right or wrong, but that is the truth. That is how they use it. And so rather than us telling them what the answer was, we found it really helpful to let them come up with the answer based on expertise and skill and knowledge. And so all we attempted to do was create this community of consensus and membership, and so they can express their own opinions. We also found that we can't interpret silence as agreement, and so a lot of these people haven't been in an environment where they feel comfortable speaking up, they feel comfortable being different, they feel comfortable disagreeing, for example. And so we found that in that circumstance, it's really best to not assume that their silence is yes. It's to assume that their silence is, I'm not sure what I want to say here. And so we use that as an opportunity to probe and ask good questions about, okay, well, nobody's speaking in this instance, and so is there like divergence here that we need to debate? Do we need to discuss something? And so it really created an open space for collaboration. So that's all great. We wrote a lot of things down. It's documented very well. You still have to do them manually. So the developer still has to go through the form, still has to fill in the form, has to wait for the request to be finished and then fill the next form. And so we haven't really simplified the things that you have to do. Like, we haven't removed the manual steps, but we have documented them. And so if we were in fact to automate these, we know the steps. We effectively built requirements from a community of people. And so we think that's interesting. We think that now that we've got requirements written down, it's fairly trivial to start to look at that as opportunities for automation. And so this is the way that we think about kind of the next evolution of that. We think that the more time they spend doing the things that we just wrote down, the less time they spend writing code. And so we think of this as like they're borrowing time, or they're forced to borrow time doing what they love to do to doing what they have to do to be successful, again, in production, right? And so that road is very long. So we feel like we're in a good place. I don't want to lie and tell you that we have made their environment fantastic, but we have a really solid foundation of requirements. So we felt like that was a really good place to start the conversation. We can now then take those requirements, start to attack areas like wait time, start to attack areas like repetitive tasks for opportunities for automation. And if we look to the industry, Gartner says that by 2025, 75% of organizations with platform teams, which I'm assuming is everybody, will provide some form of self-service in the form of developer portals to really accelerate this product innovation. And so when we look to this future in 2025, we believe that these golden paths start to set up the set of requirements or the set of things that must be done to convert that into something that's automatable, something that's repeatable, something that we can codify into something that really is fantastic. And so while it might not sound like a lot, we kind of got two things out of it. We made a path that was very easy to start, and so we've at least documented what it is you need to do in a consistent and repeatable way. We also feel like we've got some requirements that come out of that, so we can start to build some of these capabilities. When we start to look into next year, some of our goals include really making it like a one-click shop to create that component. So one click, give me that API. That API should now come baked with organizational standards, our governance policies, our compliance policies. As you can imagine, in a financial institution, that's never ending, and it's never going to be ending. But if we can start to codify some of that, we can really bake in like a real quick click start. That also includes a lot of best practices. So we like to document our patterns a lot, but when I get the pattern, I then have to implement the pattern, and that's just hard, right? So I have to continuously redo the thing that was written down, and so we think there's a lot of opportunities to automate some of that. We think that uses things like scaffolders, right, to create tooling that automatically generates that from project get-go. And so when I think about in the financial space, like a business product that maybe does a transaction, that's great, and that needs to be implemented. But there's all of the surrounding tooling and ecosystem that we talked about earlier. That could be something like logging, that could be monitoring, observability, security, the list goes on and on. If I can start to kind of give you that out of the box, then I feel like we're in a good place where I can let you do the thing that you love to do, solve your actual feature or issue or requirement, not worry about the cross-cutting concerns as much. And the end goal, what we really want to see is that like time to hello world is reduced. And so I think a lot of engineers, when they start that new project, we're a big Java shop, so I think of start.spring.io, right? I download the thing, I get hello world. Oh no, now I got to add all the Discover things to it. And so we think if we can streamline that process and we can end up with, you know, one click, hello world at Discover, we get into a much better place. Again, then they can focus developing features and really implementing, you know, solid structured software. You might be thinking to yourself, oh yeah, like that requires an architecture. And so while I don't have a picture for you, these are the things that we're thinking as we start to talk about this architecture. First, it has to be built for scale. So I can't have 20 teams supporting this across the organization. I need a core team that's responsible for a foundation. But I need to be able to support all of these organizational goals, right? So I have security engineers and operations engineers and SREs. I've got CI/CD stacks. I've got observability stacks. I've even got like portfolio management stacks. And so all of these teams need to be able to contribute to a place that lets them add their capabilities, their functionality. And so it needs to be designed, you know, with InterSource in mind. I need something that reaches all of these different communities and lets them add their opinion to the stack. So when a developer goes and creates something, they get all of those opinions baked into one. And then we believe that there's this tight feedback loop that fosters, you know, reuse and excellence. So if I can get the delivery teams, the development teams to actually use this stuff, they're the first line of defense. They're the first line of feedback. And so this cyclic loop helps us create, you know, a scalable, repeatable architecture and design. So that's our story. Yeah. Again, my name is Andrew Duckett.